My name is Matt Delacry, and when I was growing up, I missed out on some answers to some serious questions I had. Join me as I look for answers to those questions. So when we left things off, Jesus had just been taken into custody. Now it's time to go on trial for his crimes. But what exactly had he done? That's not an easy question to answer, but we're going to get to that. Here's basically what happened. Jesus was taken to Annas first. Annas was a high priest from 6 AD to 15 AD. So if you think back to the story we talked about from Jesus' early life when he got separated from his parents on a trip to Jerusalem and they found him in the temple discussing the law with the religious teachers there, Annas was a high priest during that time. Now Jesus probably wasn't talking with Annas on that occasion, but knowing that he was a high priest then should help you place him on your mental timeline. Now Annas was a very powerful figure. He had been the high priest for about 10 years before he was removed from office by Rome. However, 5 of his sons became high priest after him, and then his son-in-law, Caiaphas, became high priest. And Caiaphas was a high priest that presided over Jesus' trial, and we'll get to him in just a couple of seconds. So Annas, as I said, was still a very powerful figure. So Jesus was taken to him first, partly out of respect, and partly because he was still very influential. But Jesus knew this wasn't the final trial, so he basically ignored Annas' questions. So Jesus was then taken to Caiaphas. And so, both of these meetings took place probably in the houses of Annas and Caiaphas, which were very likely in the same palace and separated only by a courtyard. So the power structure was very much centered on that one family, and you can see this just by where people lived. Now, on to the trial, the real trial, before Caiaphas. Who was at this trial? Well, Jesus' trial took place before the Sanhedrin, the ruling council. Basically, the people at this council were the ruling class of Israel. This would be the high priests, the Sadducees, their scribes, and the elders. The people on this council then would not have been the people Jesus was interacting with on a regular basis in the Gospels. Those were the Pharisees, who were more closely connected with the people. Now, there might have been a few Pharisees in this council, but they would have been in the minority. Basically, during his ministry, Jesus was arguing against the Pharisees, who were very popular with the people but had very little real power. During this trial, though, Jesus was primarily in front of the high priests and a select group of Sadducees and their scribes, and these were the people who did have real power. Now, because of that, these people would have also had close ties with Rome, because they would have had to collaborate with Rome in order to maintain their control over Israel. And this was especially true with the high priest. And because of that, that's part of why many people thought that the temple was corrupt. Its rulers were too close to the people they're supposed to kick out, their Gentile overlords. Now, according to Jewish law, trials that involved a man's life had to take place during the daytime. However, as we talked about during the last episode, the Jewish authorities wanted to avoid a riot, so a lengthy daytime trial was probably not a good idea from their point of view. So they basically had a nighttime trial to get all the facts out and then pass judgment early in the morning so that it technically occurred during daytime. So this trial might, and there's debate on this, it might have been technically legal, but it kind of misses the point of doing everything in the open when a man's life is at stake. Anyway, to charge Jesus, they needed evidence. So that basically means they needed 2 witnesses who agreed on something that he did that was against the law. Now, there were a lot of people who would testify about him violating the Sabbath here or there, but their testimonies didn't agree, so they really didn't have anything on him. They thought for a little while that they had him on saying that he could destroy the temple in 3 days and build one not made with hands, but Mark says that even on this accusation, their testimonies didn't agree. So Caiaphas tried to get Jesus to respond to their accusations. He said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" Basically, he wanted Jesus to start talking so he could catch him in his words. But Jesus didn't respond. Since none of the witnesses' testimonies agreed with each other, no proven evidence had actually been introduced, so legally, he didn't have anything to answer for. As a last resort, Caiaphas put Jesus under oath to tell people whether he was the Messiah or not. Jesus said, "I am." Now, Matthew and Luke have things that sound evasive to us, like, "You have said so," and "You say that I am." And a lot of people think this means that he's sort of dodging the question, but really, at that time, it was discouraged to give a bald yes or no to various serious questions. For example, you can look at Jesus' answer to Judas' question in Matthew 26:25. Judas asked, "Is it I?" asking Jesus if he would be the one to betray him. And Jesus responded, "You have said so." So here we see Jesus responding in the same sort of way that he did at his trial. So we really shouldn't expect Jesus to give a simple yes or no, just because that wasn't customary at the time. So basically what that means is that all three Gospels that record this incident have Jesus giving a very clear answer, "Yes, I am the Messiah." Jesus adds to this by saying that they will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And at this point, Caiaphas tore his robe, cried out above the crowd that Jesus was guilty above blasphemy, asked what the people's verdict was, and everybody said that he deserved death. So, what just happened? Well, if you remember from the episode on Jesus' self-understanding, when he was called the Son of Man, he was giving himself a divine title. So this is probably why everybody thought he was guilty of blasphemy. But even if the Son of Man title weren't in itself blasphemous, Jesus said that he would be seated next to God, and no one gets to sit next to God. So he's really emphasizing or re-emphasizing his divine claim. Of course, there's a whole other reason they found him guilty or worthy of death that wasn't actually related to blasphemy. Now, as we talked about previously, claiming to be the Messiah was not in itself blasphemous because the Messiah was not a divine figure. However, even if Jesus had only said that he was the Messiah and left out all that Son of Man stuff, he probably still would have been put to death. Why? Well, to understand that, we need to talk about what happened before Jesus was even arrested, because before he got there, they had already decided that he was guilty. The trial was really just a formality. It was about finding something they could accuse him of officially. So let's go back to the real trial. And we find this in John 11. Now, at this point, the Jews were already looking for an opportunity to kill Jesus. And so Jesus shows up to Bethany, which is right outside of Jerusalem, and he brings a man, Lazarus, back to life with a whole bunch of people watching. Again, whether you believe in miracles or not, this is what people thought happened. So at the very least, Jesus did something that made everyone think he just raised someone from the dead. And predictably, everyone goes nuts in a variety of ways. This is what John says, quote, "Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, 'What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation.' But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, 'You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish.'" End quote. And so after they decided to put Jesus to death, after that they decided to put Jesus to death. But the question is, on what basis were they deciding to do that? There didn't seem to be anything there that we, at least, would think was actually a crime. Well, here's how they probably saw it. There were likely three sets of scriptures in their minds. And the Gospels don't record this, but they were probably thinking this in the back of their heads. And here are the three. First up is Deuteronomy 13. In this chapter, you have three categories of people who lead others astray. And in each case, the person is put to death. Second is Deuteronomy 18, and specifically the section about the false prophet. By falsely claiming to be the Messiah, Jesus would have been leading the people astray. So again, while this is not a blasphemy charge, leading the people astray was still a crime punishable by death. And third, you had Deuteronomy 21, 18-21, and this talks about the rebellious son. Basically, if a man has a rebellious son who will not listen, then that son will be stoned to death. And as we talked about in the Ancient Culture series, this was not simply about children obeying their parents. This was a social stability thing. Because of the way these group-oriented cultures worked, everyone was basically in the same boat, and this rebellious son had the ability to sink everyone. So this is basically like cutting off a limb to save the whole body. If you want more details, I talk about it in greater depth in that series, the Honor and Shame series. Or the Living in Jesus World. It's something like that. I'm forgetting the exact title off the top of my head. Anyway, all three sets of these verses really say the same thing. Basically, they thought that Jesus was leading people astray and thereby bringing God's judgment to Israel. Now, in the early 1st century AD, people believed that God would be acting soon to set everything back as it should be. There were prophetic reasons for this, and that's a whole other discussion. But in their eyes, though, around this time, they were expecting God to be fixing what was wrong. And Jesus was jeopardizing this. He was jeopardizing God finally fixing their problems. And by leading the people astray, he would be making Israel unworthy for God to set things right. And really, this wasn't an unreasonable thought. The Old Testament prophets make it very clear that the reason that Israel was sent to exile in the first place was because she had gone astray. And the worry was that if she went astray again, then God would not let her return from exile. Remember, even though she was actually living in the Promised Land, she was still being ruled over by the precious leaders from Rome. And in the minds of the religious leaders, this return from exile meant freeing them from the oppression of Rome. So this was actually legitimate to them. If Jesus were really leading the people astray, then they were just doing what God had commanded them to do and following the rules of trying to get people back on track. And that's a good thing. And think about it further from their perspective. Jesus had been setting aside some of their most important symbols and traditions, the Torah, the temple, and the Sabbath. And Jesus was replacing these things with loyalty to himself. So if you think about it, from their perspective, how could this be anything other than leading the people astray? And the signs and wonders that he was doing were just making everything worse, because through them he gained a large following. And I think many people at the time would have understood this line of thinking and probably thought it was quite reasonable, which it really was. After all, Jesus was creating problems on two fronts. He was creating problems with God and Rome. Problems with God would bring judgment, and problems with Rome would bring persecution, and neither's good. Of course, there is still the question, was Jesus actually legit? Was he really from God or not? No one at the time questioned his miraculous deeds. The question that they had was, how did he do them? In the power of God or the power of the Satan? And also, there was always Jesus teaching. Was God really doing something new with his people, or was Jesus just messing everything up? That's the real question. He made a claim and didn't really leave the people of the time, or the people of our time, with any sort of a middle ground on what we should think about him. Either he really was sent from God and was doing something special that everyone should pay attention to and follow, or he was leading the people astray, which would bring all sorts of problems. The things he said and did didn't really leave room for a third option. You basically had to choose, was he from God or not? And the religious leaders chose or not. And so, even before Jesus had his trial before Caiaphas, they had already decided that he was guilty of leading the people astray and therefore was worthy of death. All they had to do now was find a reason. Jesus claiming to be the Messiah would have been enough, because the Messiah was a person anointed by God to set everything right. And since they had decided that Jesus was leading the people astray, his claim to be the Messiah was a capital offense. And that's why Caiaphas put him under oath and made him answer the question. Of course, at that point, Jesus upped the ante and said that he was divine on top of that, and so he was accused of blasphemy. And if you think about it for a minute, that does seem like an odd claim to make. And you have to ask, why would Jesus claim something like that? Because he was on trial for his life, and he knew it. He would have known that they were going to kill him. Now, he could have gotten out of all this. He could have simply denied that he was Messiah, and then they would have had to let him go. Or he could have argued that as a Messiah, God was going to make everything right through him, and they should let him go so he could get about the business of making that happen. And When I say right, I mean right in the way that they wanted to, kicking out Rome. I mean, after all, he had quite a lot of followers, so while he was definitely outnumbered by the Romans, he had at least a decent attempt or a decent shot at it. I mean, it's certainly better than anyone else. I mean, Rome was probably going to stomp them, but he had a better shot than anybody else did. So why not try to get off the hook? And besides not trying to get off the hook, why would he have given them additional reason to kill him? Why would he have added the charge of blasphemy? It seems odd. Now, if Jesus actually thought he was divine, then it makes sense why he would do this. From his point of view, they were threatening a divine person with death. So you can see why he would react like this, because divine persons don't accept threats, not from humans. And you can see Jesus' reaction in response to Caiaphas. Jesus told Caiaphas that they would see him coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, this doesn't mean literally like Jesus riding a cloud. Caiaphas is sitting in the temple one day and he sees Jesus come whizzing by on a little cloud. That's not what Jesus was talking about. This was apocalyptic language, which is actual technical language. Think of the book of Daniel or the book of the Revelation. And it's Revelation without an S. Don't say Revelations. Just don't. Anyway, this was apocalyptic language. God was going to show them that everything that Jesus said and did was right. So, in the face of death, Jesus doubled down on all his claims, knowing that it was going to kill him. So, either he was a complete lunatic, choosing death when he could have had life, or he was actually right and his claims were legitimate. And this is the question that the Gospels leave us with. They present us with a person of Jesus and force us to choose him being someone who either wasn't right in the head or someone who actually spoke the truth. Either he was out of his mind or he actually was who he said he was. And that's what the Gospels try to make you have to decide between. And that's really the choice that everybody at the time had to choose between. Was he actually legitimate or was he out of his mind and leading the people astray? Anyway, back to the trials. So Jesus was found guilty of blasphemy. And at this point, we have to ask two questions. One, why was he not killed immediately? And two, why was he not stoned? Well, the answers are related, but let's start with the second one. Why was he not stoned? The Old Testament punishment for blasphemy was stoning and not crucifixion. And yet, Jesus was crucified. So why? Why wasn't he stoned? Well, perhaps Caiaphas wanted something more public. Or it could also be that crucifixion was special. Remember, getting crucified counted as being hung on a tree, since you're literally hanging from a couple of planks of wood. And as we talked about when we were looking at whether Jesus actually existed or not, there was a curse that one was placed under by being hung on a tree. So perhaps Caiaphas wanted to bring an extra curse on him, on this man who falsely claimed to be the Messiah. Perhaps it was just the public nature of it, and he wanted to make Jesus look foolish in a whole bunch of people and sort of really kill this claim. And partly it was because to do it at the hands of the Romans means that the Gentiles would be the ones killing him, and the Messiah is supposed to, get rid of the Gentiles, not the other way around. So probably all this together would be good reasons in Caiaphas' mind to want to do it by crucifixion rather than stoning, and do it in a very public way instead of just, stone him real quick and then show everybody that he's dead in the morning. However, the primary reason he wasn't killed instantly was probably because the Jewish leaders didn't have the authority to kill Jesus. Now, Jewish sources say that sometime between AD 6 and AD 70, there was a reduction in the judicial powers that the Jewish leaders had over themselves. Later on, James, the brother of Jesus, would be executed under Annas II. And Annas II would be dismissed from office for executing someone without proper authorization. So you see it already by that point. So probably what was going on is the Sanhedrin could legally pass sentence on Jesus, but they couldn't execute him. Only the Roman governor could do that. And the Jewish leaders would be unlikely to take matters in their own hands during a feast when both Pilate and Herod were in town, and there were probably extra soldiers around as well. So they had to take Jesus to Pontius Pilate and get him to pass sentence. Pilate probably had what was called full imperium. That means he had criminal, judicial, and jurisdictional authority, as well as the authority to levy taxes. And this is something that came directly from the emperor, and he could not delegate these powers to anyone. So, because Jesus was being charged with a crime that carried a death sentence, no one but Pilate could sentence him. Now, because this was a Roman trial, there would have been no jury, though Pilate may have had counselors. Similar to today, there would have been accusers who made some claim against the defendant. However, unlike today, there would have been no defense attorney. Jesus was on his own. As the judge, Pilate would have questioned the accused, Jesus, and come to a conclusion. However, the Jewish leaders could not simply bring Jesus to Pilate on the charge that he was leading Israel astray. Pilate probably wouldn't care at all about Jesus leading astray. And in fact, since Pilate really didn't like the Jews, he might have even liked the idea of Jesus leading astray. So before the Jewish leaders brought Jesus to Pilate, they changed the charges up a bit to make them sound like something a Roman leader would find objectionable. The reason the Jewish leaders got angry at Jesus was because they thought he committed blasphemy, but when they brought him before Pilate, they accused him of claiming to be a king. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a king of Israel in Jewish theology. Being the king of Israel was a good thing. To them, it was a problem that Jesus was claiming to be king because he was wrong in their minds. And because of that, he was leading the people astray. However, to the Romans, being a king was definitely not a good thing. Romans hated the idea of a king. They had some kings in their early history, and things didn't go so well. So even when the Roman Republic fell, ruled by the Senate, and it became an empire ruled by a single man, that person was never called a king. He was the emperor, or more commonly he was called princeps, which means first one or first citizen. So even though they really did have a king, they avoided using the name king for their ruler because they had such a bad history with people who had that title. So by presenting Jesus as a self-proclaimed king, they figured they could get at Pilate's Roman sensibilities and win an emotional point. However, besides the emotional point of the title king, there was actually a practical point. By claiming to be a king, Jesus was saying that he was in fact in charge, and Caesar was not. So in Rome's eyes, he would have been considered a revolutionary, and Rome kills revolutionaries. And the Jewish leaders knew this. So they presented him as a revolutionary who was claiming Caesar's throne. It seemed like an easy win. What could possibly go wrong? So Jesus is brought to Pilate and is charged with being the king of the Jews. And so Pilate asked Jesus the obvious question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus was basically like, "Yep." Modified slightly, but he basically said yes. And the chief priests accused him of a whole bunch of stuff, and Jesus just stands there. He says nothing. So he's being tried for a crime that will sentence him to literal death by torture, and he just stands there and says nothing. Now, if you're Pilate, you've got to be like, hold on a minute. Something's not right here. First of all, I'm a Roman. The Jews hate me, and I hate them too. The feeling's mutual. But if they really had a king, someone who could actually rule over them and maybe kick me and my Roman buddies out of Israel, why would they ever deliver this guy over to me to try to have him killed? That doesn't make any sense. So it's obvious that the Jewish leaders don't believe Jesus. So Pilate has to wonder, why would they bring him to me to have him killed? Matthew and Mark say that Pilate perceived it was because of envy or jealousy that they delivered him up. Now, you might say that this was just the gospel writers trying to make Jesus look good and make his opponents look bad. But if you think about it, it really is the only answer that makes sense. If Jesus was a very popular figure who did many things that people believed were miracles, and who many people believed was Messiah, you can see why some people might envy him. Anyone who was in power or had the ear of people prior to Jesus would have seen their power and influence slip away over the last few years. As a general rule, people who pursue power don't like to lose that power. So really, this envy thing is probably not mere propaganda that the gospel authors are using to try to make their side look better. It's just how humans function. If you have something that you really value and someone takes it away from you, you're not happy. And when you want something that someone else has, or you want to be in their shoes, at least one way of describing that is envy or jealousy. So the charge that they were envious is really pretty reasonable. And so is the fact that Matthew and Mark said that Pilate figured out that the Jewish leaders were envious. It would not have taken a genius to figure that out. And Pilate probably wasn't stupid, even though he was a lot of other things. The Jewish leaders were delivering up a really popular figure they claimed was their king. If they really believed he was their king, though, they would have followed him. But instead, they were trying to kill him. And it would have been very reasonable for Pilate to think that they were doing this because Jesus had become really popular and they had lost a lot of the power and influence over the people. Okay, so the first thing that seemed odd seems to make sense now. The reason they're delivering their king to be killed is because of jealousy. You could see how Pilate would probably be working these things out in his head. So what about the second thing that doesn't make sense? There's this guy who's on trial for his life, and he's just standing there and not even attempting to get out of this. What's up with that? Both Matthew and Mark say Pilate was amazed at this, and you have to be like, well, duh. I mean, if you were about to be crucified, don't you think you would come up with anything to get yourself out of being tortured to death? And don't you think Pilate was probably used to everyone begging and pleading for mercy and arguing that they were really innocent and it was all just a big misunderstanding? That probably happened all the time. And then he gets this guy who's handed over to him on made-up charges, and Pilate knows that they're made up because, again, why would they deliver over their own king? And the guy doesn't even defend himself. The Jewish leaders' motives make sense, but Jesus' don't. If you were Pilate, wouldn't you wonder, what's up with this guy? So you can understand why Matthew and Mark said Pilate was amazed when Jesus didn't try to defend himself. And you can understand how Pilate might be confused by this whole situation and think, this is really odd, something's probably going on that I just don't understand. It's probably just best to get out of this. He doesn't want to give the Jewish leaders what they want because he's anti-Jewish, and this Jesus guy kind of weirds him out. So Pilate comes up with a creative way to get out of the situation. At the feast, there was a custom where he would release one prisoner for the crowd. So he's like, you can either have Jesus, this guy who probably hasn't done anything wrong, or you can have Barabbas, who's a murderer. And he thinks, all right, that ought to take care of it. And the crowd was like, we want Barabbas. And he's like, seriously, y'all? So, that didn't work. What now? Well, the next idea Pilate has is, what if I punish Jesus? Maybe that will satisfy the crowd. So he has Jesus scourged, which is a Roman punishment where a person gets whipped with a whip that has lots of little ends on it with little pieces of metal and bone that are tied into each one of those ends. And basically, when you hit the victim with it, it tears their flesh off. And this would have messed up Jesus pretty badly. And Pilate was hoping that this would have been enough for the Jews who brought him there. And so, the scourging that Jesus received was not unusual. Sometimes the scourging would be done as the only punishment when there was a lighter offense, or for more serious crimes, such as usually would be brought before someone like Pilate. A beating or scourging was common prior to the main punishment as a way of publicly shaming the person, if the person was found guilty. So Pilate's like, well, I'll go ahead and do this, and maybe that'll be enough for them, and then we'll just call this a lighter punishment and let them off with that. And Jesus gets back to Pilate, all covered in blood and really messed up. And there's probably a decent chance he'll die from his wounds anyway. But either way, not Pilate's fault. But to make it even better, Pilate discovers that when the soldiers had him, they made him a crown of thorns and put a purple robe on him, basically mocking him for his obviously fake claim to be king. In other words, they literally added insult to injury. And Pilate's like, maybe this will be enough to satisfy the crowd. So he takes him back out there again. I mean, he knows the Jews have delivered Jesus up out of jealousy, and he doesn't like the Jews anyway. So if he can upset the Jews by letting Jesus off the hook, then great. And remember, he also doesn't really know what's up with Jesus anyway. So, you got this guy who's not even trying to defend himself. So that's pretty odd. And really, he just wants to get out of this whole mess. So Pilate presents Jesus to the crowd, a Jesus who has literally been torn apart and then dressed up like a king, fake king. And Pilate was like, "Here you go." And the chief priests cried, "Crucify him." And Pilate was like, "You crucify him? What are you talking about? This man is innocent." And they said, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he's made himself to be the Son of God." And Pilate starts freaking out. Now, the thing you should know about Romans is that they were very superstitious. Now, I don't say that because they believed in lots of gods. That was pretty normal. I mean that in the sense that they believed that all kinds of things cause good luck and bad luck, and you had to be super careful about everything or you could wind up causing yourself to have bad luck. For example, you know that tradition where after a couple gets married, grooms carry their brides across the threshold into the house? Well, that's a Roman tradition. It was considered bad luck if a bride tripped on her way into the house after she got married, so the groom carried her across the threshold so she couldn't possibly trip. It's a cute thing for us to do, but Romans took that stuff seriously because if bad luck happened, then, things are going to go very badly for a long time and you don't want to risk that. So you have to do all these little things to make sure that bad luck doesn't happen. And they did a lot of that stuff. So this is a situation. You've got a superstitious Roman who is already a little on edge about this Jesus guy because he won't defend himself. And now the Jewish leaders are saying that he's making himself out to be the son of their God. And if you're the kind of person who cares about your bride tripping on her way into your house and causing yourself some bad luck, what do you think would happen to you if you crucified the son of a god? Not the God, mind you, you're a polytheist, but the son of a god. That's still pretty bad, though. Meddling in the affairs of God, or meddling in the affairs of gods, never ends well, and crucifying the son of a god is guaranteed to end badly for you. Now, Matthew says that prior to this, Pilate's wife, Procula, sent Pilate a note during the trial that said, "Have nothing to do with that man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." Now, a lot of people who don't believe in Christianity dismiss this, because to them it seems like something Matthew just made up to make his story better. However, it's perfectly reasonable to read this from the perspective of Roman superstition. And when you put all these things together, what you end up with is a pretty wigged out Pilate. And so Pilate goes back inside with Jesus to talk to him privately and asks him, "Where are you from?" In other words, are you from heaven? Are you really the son of a god? Remember, Romans are both polytheists and superstitious, so to them, it's entirely within the realm of possibility for someone to be the son of a god. Remember Zeus from Greek mythology and all the children he had with mortal women? Pilate's worried that Jesus could be like that, and the last thing he wants to do is bring divine judgment on himself for killing the son of one of the gods. So he asks, "Where are you from?" And Jesus says, "Nothing." Doesn't answer. And you can just hear Pilate, who's becoming more and more unstable, trying to get Jesus to respond to him to say something, anything. It's like, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" And Jesus looks him in the eye and says, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." And Pilate freaks out. He is certain now that he is caught in the middle of something that is going on that the gods are doing, and this never goes well for mortals, especially for mortals who crucify the son of one of the gods. So Pilate does everything he can to try to get Jesus off the hook. Pilate is now facing the crowd and trying to get them to be okay with letting Jesus off. I mean, certainly he could just let Jesus go. But remember, this was during the Passover feast. The city has several times the number of people in it that it normally does. There are hundreds of thousands of people in the city, and Pilate only has a few hundred soldiers. His men would have been outnumbered by somewhere between 200 to 1 and 500 to 1. If a riot broke out, there was nothing he could do. So he had to get the crowd to be okay with letting Jesus go. At this point, the crowd starts shouting, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Now, we lose something in translation here. To read it in English, it just sounds like the crowd is shouting for Pilate to crucify Jesus. And to Pilate, that would have been intimidating enough. But when you read it in Greek, in the original language of of the Gospels that we have in the New Testament, you get a completely different picture. In Greek, away with him, crucify him reads, Aaron, starosinaton. And there's a rhyme and a rhythm to it that you can chant this. So what they're doing really isn't shouting. They're chanting like at a riot. Aaron, starosinaton. Aaron, starosinaton. And this is the riot that Pilate wanted to avoid. The riot of people who almost certainly would have come after him if it broke out. And it looks like it might be starting. And the people's energy over this whole Jesus thing is just rising. But Pilate knows what's at stake. The last thing he wants to do is get on the bad side of a god. And he keeps pressing his luck, trying to get Jesus off the hook. What has he done? He's innocent. Aaron, starosinaton. I've already scourged him. He's probably going to die of his wounds anyway. Aaron, starosinaton. He's no trouble to you. Better to take him over Barabbas, a murderer. Aaron, starosinaton. At this point, the religious leaders played their last card, and their best one. They cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." They basically told Pilate, if you release this man, we're going to go to Caesar and tell him you let someone go who claimed that he should be king instead of you. And Pilate would have certainly been killed for this. What the Jewish leaders were telling Pilate is, one of you is going to die, Pilate. It's either you or Jesus. Your choice. And this hits Pilate hard because he knows it's true. There's no way out. Either you let an innocent man suffer or you suffer yourself. Somebody's going to pay the consequences. Aaron, starosinaton. So Pilate starts thinking as fast as he can. Okay, this guy Jesus is freaking me out. Something is up with him. Who would face crucifixion and not defend himself? I mean, I know the Jewish leaders are trying to kill him because they're jealous of him. They're probably just jealous because more people are following Jesus. But what if there is something to his claims? What if he really is sent by their God? Am I going to have a God angry at me? Aaron, starosinaton. What's worse, having a God angry at you at some point in the future or dying now? Either from the rioting crowd or the execution of Caesar. The Jews are definitely going to go to Caesar, and I will certainly be put to death if I let someone go who calls himself a king. Aaron, starosinaton. Man, I'm going to get them for putting me in this situation. What do I do about it now? Aaron, starosinaton. I could let an innocent man go, but then I would certainly suffer the consequences myself. The Jews were right. It's either him or me. So what do I do? Aaron, starosinaton. And Pilate raises his hand and silences the crowd. The chanting slowly dies down. Crucify him. And the crowd roars with excitement. Pilate washes his hands as if to say to the gods, this wasn't my idea. This was theirs. And Jesus is led away to be crucified.